welcome you all to the Holland Land Office Museum tonight. We're very happy to have the next edition of our guest speaker series. Welcoming back for the umpteenth time Joyce Thompson-Hovey over here, who's always done a great job for us with something around the Civil War, and tonight is no exception. And it's a topic I knew nothing about, so maybe somebody in the audience has heard of our subject tonight, but I'm sure you'll all learn something very valuable. So, Joyce, take it away.
Thank you. I like to do programs that are about people that you don't know a lot about. You maybe know one thing about them, or you may know nothing about them. And one thing I hate to do is go to a program and say, gee, I knew all that right to come. So I think it's important to learn some new things. And I was a teacher for 40 years. I started high school social studies, ended up in 5th grade, still teaching social studies. And after I retired in 2011, I decided to do something else. And so my husband said, well, you're still teaching, it's just adults. And I love to research. And so this is one that I do a lot on Civil War, I do a lot on women. Because women have been a group that has been ignored and not told about. And I think it's important to get their names out there. So, this one is called Lincoln's Secret Weapon. Now, I have a question for you. How many of you have heard of Anna Ella Carroll before today or before reading the description of our presentation? This is the 4th time I've given this, and so far I've had nobody raise a hand. Okay? So I'm not surprised that nobody's heard of her because I hadn't either. I'm not exactly sure how. I read a lot. I must have heard her name there or on some Facebook or History Channel or PBS, and I thought, oh, that'd make a great program. So when it comes to Ella Carroll, there are more questions than answers. She's kind of one of these people that some people believe things and some don't, and anyway, and there lies the frustration of largely forgotten woman. It's hard to research. In doing my research, I discovered many various interpretations by various historians of her role during the Civil War. This woman may have helped the Union win the Civil War, but yet we haven't heard of her. And so I think it's important to learn who she is. So I always start with a short biography of the person so you have a little idea of where they came from when they were born. She was the eldest of 8 children, which was quite normal back then. Families were quite large. She was born in 1850, and that's an important thing to keep in mind, especially with women and the role of women, thinking back to what it was like in 1850. Her father was Thomas King Carroll. She was born into a very wealthy and prominent family. Had she not been, she probably couldn't accomplish the things that she did. Her great-grandfather, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and the last surviving signer and delegate to the Second Continental Congress, and later in the new Congress of the United States. Her father was governor of Maryland from 1830 to 31, and her mother was a daughter of a Baltimore physician. So you get an idea of what her life was like. And because she came from a very obviously historically minded group of ancestors, that determined a lot about how far she could go. William Thomas Carroll, her grandfather, and I thought this was very interesting, was a clerk in the Supreme Court and gave a Bible to Lincoln in his first inauguration, and used later by Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and they're swearing in. I remember when they were standing there, they mentioned that this Bible had been in Lincoln, but they never really mentioned his name. So when I found that, I thought, well, that's really interesting. Her childhood, both parents served as intellectual role models. They were both very intelligent and well-educated. Her early years were spent in the family library. That's where she liked to spend her time, which gives you an idea of why she was so well-versed in so many things. Her handwritten notes on family genealogy suggested she did much as a young person and began her writing career researching family history. And of course, I do genealogy, and genealogy is history, and it's learning about the different time periods, and so she was well-versed right from childhood. She studied religion, ethics, philosophy, history, and science, which was very advanced education for women. Most women, if they were educated at all, were just in domestic things because they thought all they had to do was to have babies and take care of the house and the children. They didn't need to know anything more than that. Because this is talking again, early 1800s. Her father trained her for the law, and of course there were no women lawyers at that time, but he had the background, and a strong background in military and constitutional law. And those three things are very important in understanding what she did as far as Lincoln was concerned. At an early age, Carroll became involved in her father's political and legal activities. Educated and trained by him, she gradually gained entry into the male world of politics. Even though it was kind of behind the scenes, she was still there. By the age of 12, get this in mind, she's 12 years old, and she learned to assist her father in his work by finding legal passages from his law books for use in the debates in the Southern legislature. She is 12 years old, so obviously she's quite a precocious girl and fast learner and really interested in this sort of stuff. And her father fostered it, which didn't always be true of a lot of fathers back in that time. In the spring of 1829, when she was 13, Democratic Andrew Jackson was elected president, and Thomas, her father, ran for and was elected governor. Anna contributed to her family income, even though this surprised me because I don't think they were poor, but anyway, maybe they thought she should be involved in something. So she established a girls' school at her home, Kingston Hall. Now back then, you didn't have to have all this college in order to become a teacher. Many of them were 14, 13, 14, 15 years old. All they had to do was be able to read and write and want to be a teacher. And hocus pocus, they were a teacher. Unlike today. She was active in politics. Anna became a kind of combination secretary, social guy, lobbyist. She did all these certain things for her father. She was kind of an advisor, and when he was a governor, flexing her society connections to keep his name relevant. And of course, by keeping his name relevant, she met all these key people. And so she later in life, she had contacts with all these important people and was up to date on political issues of the day. At the age of 29, she began writing press releases for a railroad company in Baltimore. Her work for the railroads, as well as her family's strong political background, allowed her to easily slip into the world of politics that was so familiar to her. The Whig Party, during an era when women were not expected to know or understand anything about politics and war, by the age of 35, she was active in the Whig Party. Through her relationship with President Taylor and later President Fillmore, so she ran in those circles. She maintained involvement in party development and also in policy making. So she had a strong background in this. She wrote letters to party officials to influence political decisions. In a sense, she could scheme, connive, and maneuver as well as any man. And at that time, those are not attributes that a man would really be interested in to have as a wife, of course. And as you find out, she never did marry. I'm sure you're not real surprised about that, because she had very forward-thinking ideas that didn't exactly jive with the men of the period.
Well, don't you think that she, since she was so good in talking to people, and she had the knowledge that the men accepted her like she was?
Some
I
did.
think.
Some did.
Okay.
And some didn't exactly like the idea that a woman could possibly know what
Right.
they know or more. I mean,
Right.
that.
Right.
So it was a mixed, probably reception. Okay, because of her acquaintance with men like Winford Scott, Carroll began sitting in regularly at the visitors' gallery in the Senate. Of course, she had to sit up in a balcony, with other people, women. There she met many powerful men and future presidents, such as James Buchanan, whom she briefly dated, so she did date. And she also became close friends with Millard Fillmore in the early 1850s. Along with other reformers, Anna Carroll campaigned by writing against urban machine corruption. So she was kind of a journalist. She wrote about crime and what was perceived as a political threat of the power of the Catholic Church. Now back then, a lot of political institutions didn't exactly agree with the Catholic Church. They thought they were too strong and too this and that, and so that's not unusual. She also helped found an entirely political party, aligning herself with pro-union Americans otherwise known as a Know-Nothing Party. You might have heard of that before. By 1856, during the presidential election, Carroll supported and campaigned on behalf of Willard Fillmore. At that time, he was part of the Know-Nothing. She wrote pamphlets and articles, and she toured the Northeast, and in his behalf. She was considered moderate, and Fillmore carried the state of Maryland. But unfortunately, that was his only victory. But it was probably a victory due to her, because she was from Maryland, and she talked about him and promoted him. In opposing the pro-slavery Democrats, the Know-Nothings became a powerful, decisive party in the state. They were pro-union, pro-labor, anti-Catholic, and anti-immigrant. And just as a side note, I never realized that the KKK was so strong in our state. But even the 1920s it was. And at that time I also learned it wasn't strictly just anti-black. It was anti-immigrants and anti-Catholics. So we had to do. In other words, you wanted to be quite English-accent Protestant elite. For the 1856 campaign, she published 2 party booklets, A Great League Study of Political and Press Contacts. Those are the names of the books. And she also wrote a lot of pamphlets on the Union of the States. Unlike many women of her day, Carroll had been broadly educated. Again, most weren't. She put that education and her love of the written word to work on behalf of her favorite political causes. And I highlighted the writing anonymous, because at that time it had a woman's name on it. It just didn't have as much power or prestige as a man. So if it was anonymous, they probably thought it had to be a man wrote it. He just didn't put his name on it. She wrote letters to the editor of influential newspapers of the day expressing her political views. She was a very outspoken lady. She may have been unable to vote, and of course, she couldn't vote until 1920, so this is way before the women's right to vote. She turned her ability to convince others into a career, becoming a professional lobbyist on behalf of the railroad companies, and acting as an early version of the press agent for her friend, the governor, that Maryland. So she did a lot of things that women just didn't get involved in during that time. Okay, along comes 1860. We're getting closer to the Civil War era. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, she wasn't so sure about him at the time. Okay, but she hadn't met him, and she wasn't sure if he was the right person. However, as an anti-slavery spokesperson, she celebrated an election by freeing all of her slaves. So her family did own slaves, and she owned them, but she freed them because she was so impressed with Abraham Lincoln. Upon meeting Lincoln, Carroll was impressed by his loyalty to the Union, a sentiment which she fully shared. She was very patriotic. She believed in the United States of America. She believed in the Union. Although they had met in social situations before, parties and things like that, this was the first time they were able to talk in depth about the state of the nation. So she had a good rapport, you might say, with Lincoln. She met him at the parties and stuff, but now she was actually able to talk to him. And back then, when somebody was president, the White House was open to anybody. You could walk in at any time, day or night, and maybe get a chance to talk to the president. There was really they did have bodyguards, but it wasn't anything like today. And so people would go in and out of the White House very easily, and she was one of them. She devoted herself to what she saw as constitutional rights. Remember, we said even as a child, she studied constitutional law from her father, so she knew the Constitution. And it was their duty to suppress the rebels in the South. Even though Maryland was a southern state, she didn't agree with that. She was anything but the state was not pro-Lincoln, and it was obviously in favor of slavery. In the summer of 1861, Carroll wrote a political pamphlet responding to a speech given on the floor of the Senate by John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. And he really criticized Lincoln big time. He argued that Lincoln had acted in violation of the Constitution by mustering state militia into service following Fort Sumter. And Breckinridge said, no, the president does not have the right to do that. Okay? He also suspended the writ of habeas corpus and imposed martial law and a naval blockade. And according to Breckinridge, the president does not have that power. In her reply, she wrote a whole pamphlet on this, giving her ideas on it. which was widely circulated by the Lincoln administration, of course. Carroll made informed legal arguments, which of course she knew how to do. She argued, later used by Attorney General Edward Bates, stating that Lincoln had acted in accordance with the Constitution. So actually Bates copied a lot of what she said and thought it was good and used it. She wrote Lincoln as president had the right to suspend habeas corpus and executive function to make political decisions using the presidential wartime powers. The president has certain extra powers during wartime, and according to her, he had every right to use that. Lincoln spoke frankly with Carroll about his need for her expert, strategical mind and extensive political background. He had a war on his hands and he needed all the help that he thought she could give him. Many believe that Lincoln asked her to become an unofficial member of his cabinet, acting as a top advisor to him with access to the White House at any time, day or night, and she enthusiastically accepted the offer. Now, there's a debate on some people believe this is true, some people don't, but there's a lot to substantiate it, a lot. Because, of course, he couldn't make her part of the cabinet because she was a woman. There was no way. So he couldn't officially do this. He had to do it unofficially. In the fall of 1861, he asked Carroll to travel to St. Louis to work with a secret agent, Judge O'Neill Dale Evans, who had been appointed by Secretary of State William Seward to assess the feasibility of a Union invasion of Texas. So she was sent kind of an advisory to study this and research. Remember, her main thing was she was really good at researching, knowing constitutional law, knowing military strategy, and all that sort of thing. Her first assignment was to observe and report the general sentiments of the soldiers. She talked to the soldiers and see what their opinions were. As a woman, she probably would not be suspected of being an informer to the president. And if you study anything about the Civil War, a lot of the best spies were women, because they could be in a house serving the people, and here they would talk in front of them. They would tell them what their plans, what they were going to do, and how many soldiers they had, when they were going to move, because it was a woman. And they would talk freely in front of them. Under the light of an oil lamp, she studied the crude maps and the land for a better route, one that would take the South by surprise. After many hours, a brilliant alternative dawned on Carroll. Why not use the Tennessee River? The Tennessee River plan came into existence. She worked all night on her discovery. She devised a plan that would cut the Southern forces in half by intercepting the very railroad lines she had helped design years earlier, so she knew all about the railroads. The South was now using these lines to transport supplies to their troops. The troops could not get food and ammunition from the Charleston and Memphis railroads. They would be forced to surrender immediately. So this was a very important plan. Again, she knew about the railroad, she knew about maps, she knew all this stuff. And she said this would be a good way to do it, and we would cut off the South from their supplies. The Union Army could use the Tennessee River to surprise the Confederate Army, but at an angle that they did not expect them to use. Moreover, the Tennessee River flowed north, so any troubled gunboats would float with the current back to the safety of the Northern side. So this was also important. So she took all of these things into advisement when she devised this plan. Carroll had a mastermind and amazing plan, but she still had some crucial questions to ask that she herself couldn't answer. And of course, being a woman, they'll ask, they'll ask somebody and want somebody else's advice. They don't think, oh, I know it all. No, she knew that she didn't know it all, and she needed some advice. Was the Tennessee deep enough to hold gunboats? She didn't know. What were the water current speed? She didn't know that. Where were the points of landing? Again, she wasn't concerned. She didn't have any knowledge of that. So she wasted no time in seeking out a riverboat pilot who was loyal to the north. Charles Scott was his name. He knew the Tennessee River well, and he gave Carroll the information she needed to ensure that her plan would be successful. So before she initiated any plan, she wanted to do a full research, know every little thing, so she had all her ducks in order before she presented this to anybody. So she acted on her newfound insight and wrote a letter to the then Assistant Secretary of War, who was Thomas Scott, whom she met earlier in Washington. Remember, she had a lot of contacts, which helps. She related to Scott the intelligence she had gathered about the river and outlined to him the modifications of the Anaconda Plan. Now, the Anaconda Plan was the idea that all these boats were along the east coast, and they were not letting ships the south go anywhere or come in, because the south and the north had all their own industries. You could make all their own clothes and everything, but the south depended on England. So if they had a blockade, the English, they couldn't send the south couldn't send their cotton out, and the finished textiles couldn't come in from England. So this was all part of the plan too, but that was already in place. Scott was immediately impressed with her idea and relayed them to President Lincoln. So, effective February 1862, according to Secretary of War Scott, when Lincoln received Carroll's proposed battle plan, he expressed overwhelming relief, joy, and hope. And that was a book that I used for information. The President ordered the plan to go into effect as a military strategy, February 1862, keeping very silent about whose idea it was. And so that's why it's really hard to sometimes research women, because they weren't given credit for things. And so, you know, it's more difficult. Where the men were given credit, it was easy to track them. Lincoln was already frustrated with lack of strategic insight and innovation displayed by senior Army, such as McClellan. McClellan was the general of the Army of the Potomac. He was, he dressed perfectly. He was well-read, everything, you know. And he had plans. Oh my goodness, he had wonderful plans. The only thing is they were plans, and he never really initiated. Or he said, well, the weather isn't quite right, or I just don't have enough people, and he was known as having the slows. So Lincoln was really upset with him. And so having a new plan was great. Lincoln adopted Carroll's plan to look for a suitable Secretary of War to oversee it. So he then picked, this is when Edwin Stanton became the Secretary of War. He wasn't the original one. Scott was, but Scott was pretty old. I mean, he was in the early 1812. He was old. Edwin Stanton, who was also been informed, he was very impressed with Carroll's plan, and he told Lincoln that, okay, I think we should go with it. Stanton was confirmed as Secretary of War in January, and of course February was when the Tennessee Plan was initiated. 3 weeks before, Grant and Edwin Foote captured the Confederate Fort Henry in Donelson and Tennessee and Cumberland rivers respectively. This thrust was a direct result of Lincoln's faith in Carroll's plan, and that Stanton was appointed largely because he did believe in this plan. So he was appointed in January, and then 3 weeks later in February, Grant, and they took over all the forts, and it was very successful. So the Tennessee Plan was a great success. On February 6th, Fort Henry fell to Foote's gunboats, and February 13th, Fort Donelson fell to Grant's and Foote's combined forces. These comprised the first two real big victories of the Civil War for the Union. Unfortunately, the Union was, General Lee was a wonderful general. In fact, Lincoln wanted him to be the general, but Lee said he could not go against his family and his state. And so he said he declined the offer, but he was offered at first. He was first in his class, and he was, West Point, he was a fantastic general. And that's why it lasted 4 years, because he was so good. But anyway, so the Union finally got some victories under their belt, and General William Sherman wrote later, at the time Carroll's role in the effort again was kept secret. Nobody knew about that. Immediately following the war, she gave credit to Captain Charles Scott in a letter printed in a leading Washington newspaper. Years later, Assistant Secretary of War Scott and Senator Wade testified to her critical role before Congress. And I'm going to tell you, after the war is over, all this poor lady did to try to get some money and some, realization that she was so involved in all this recognition. The enormous success of the mission made people across the nation want to know who could have come up with such a wonderful plan. There were rumors of a woman working in Washington, but Carroll's name was not leaked to the public. So there was rumors, the normal Washington political rumor mill, but nobody really knew who it was. 1862, under an agreement made with the government, she had produced 3 war power pamphlets. She was great on writing. She was a wonderful writer. She wrote pamphlets and booklets to to get out to the public to substantiate why we were doing all these things. And they presented able constitutional arguments supporting the federal government, and they had the right to do these different actions. The president was so enthusiastic about her writing that he secured government funding for a 50,000 run printing of one of the most influential pamphlets. So he said, okay, this is great. We're gonna get this out to the public. I think he did a great job. We're gonna make 50,000 copies and we're gonna hand them out. And he invited her to the White House for a confidential interview. He was impressed and enlisted her as an unofficial advisor. This is when they think, she became part of the cabinet. Along comes the Emancipation Proclamation. During the remainder of the war, Carroll worked with Lincoln on issues pertaining to emancipation and colonization of American slaves. Now, at one time, one of the thoughts was, okay, we're going to set them free, what are we going to do with them? Okay, and one of the thoughts was to put them in a colony in Belize, South America. Another one was to send them to one in Africa. So that was one of the ideas. She and Aaron Columbus Burr lobbied him to establish a colony of freedmen in British Honduras and also the Lakes. They thought this would be better. They would like it better that way. Okay, and I think it was also to appease the South. Although Carroll had freed her own slaves, she lobbied Lincoln against issuing the proclamation right at this time, and he did defer it. And he decided he would wait until they had a great victory before they came out with this. Again, she used news articles and letters to accomplish her purpose. Her pro-union crusade culminated in an effort to get President Lincoln to plan the future of American life. She said, we gotta make a plan. She's great on plans. We gotta make a plan. Once we free them, what are we going to do with them? So you got to think forward. You got to think, what are we going to do afterwards? But she wrote that Lincoln did have a constitutional right to flee the slaves as a temporary war measure. Under his powers, commander-in-chief, she said, this is fine, because the proclamation would help cripple the organized forces of the rebellion. She thought it really hit, like it was a two-man punch to the South. Yet the measure was not a transfer of title. It would have to be suspended once the war emergency. And in other words, it was just good for the time of duration of the war. Then after that, you would have to have a constitutional amendment to actually free all the slaves. Because technically, all he was freeing was the slaves themselves. And there were still some in the North. Not many, but there were some. The North had a lot of slaves earlier in American history, in the 1700s. By the mid-1800s, almost all of them were freed. Eventually, indirect recognition came in Francis V. Carpenter's 1864 painting of Lincoln in his cabin at the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, if anybody's ever been to my programs, they always know I have a T-shirt that goes with the program. Well, this, if you recognize, is the picture of that Carpenter painted of all the cabinet members in the Emancipation Proclamation. And I've seen it many times. I've never really thought about it. But the picture shows an empty chair over here, and I'll show you a better picture of it. Similar to those, and it had folded maps and notes, similar to what she had carried. It is believed that this Carpenter's way of acknowledging the unrecognized member of the cabinet. Now, here's the picture in the figure. Okay. There's all the cabinet members. And if you notice here, there's an empty chair with maps and things, pamphlets and booklets on the ground. So I think he knew that she was unofficial, but she couldn't put him in there because she was a woman. She could not be in the cabinet. But he kind of, got it in there in an indirect way. And I never thought of that when I've seen it. I'm sure you've all seen this picture many, many times. And you probably never realized, whoops, you probably never realized there was an empty chair there. Because all the rest of the cabinet members are all there and accounted for. The war was far from over, however. As it raged on, Carroll continued to work side by side with Lincoln and Grant until the end of the war. During the final months of war, Lincoln began planning the reconstruction of the country, with Carroll at his side offering advice, because he had to plan reconstruction. And unfortunately, of course, that never, Lincoln's version and plan, and probably Carroll's too, never was able to come about because of his assassination. In March of 1865, Anna Ella Carroll received an anonymous letter before Delaware. It read, "Madam, it is rumored in the Southern Army that you furnished a plan or information that caused the United States government to abandon the expedition designed to descend the Mississippi River and transfer the Army up the Tennessee River in 1862. We wish to know if this is true. If it is, you are the veriest of traitors to your section, and we warn you that you stand upon a volcano." Signed, Confederates. So this, this was a warning that, hey, you don't want to mess. You don't want to get involved in this. And so you realize that some people did know who it was. Post-war, war ends. After Lincoln was assassinated, she devoted her efforts to Reconstruction. However, she was largely ignored. It wasn't Lincoln anymore. It was other men in politics, and they go, you lost, lady. We don't need your help. So she wasn't as influential after the war, although they didn't mean she didn't do something. Okay. She aided war victims and vets. She procured discharges for Union prisoners. She lobbied officers to obtain jobs for soldiers and sailors, surviving family members. She was still involved in Maryland politics and continued writing. So even though she wasn't really involved in the federal government doing Reconstruction, she really did her part to help mainly the civilians that were not civilians and the families of the deceased. In the post-war, Carroll traveled with evidence to report on his role in Texas Constitutional Convention to draw up a new state constitution. She was active in the Republican Party in Maryland, continued her political writing career, so she still stayed active. Okay. Post-war advises Grant. Grant, with whom Carroll had communicated by telegraph from Washington many times when he was in the battlefield, was being backed by an overwhelming number of people for the office of the presidency. Grant asked Carroll to do what she did best, advise him from his post as general of the Union Army to his job as president of the United States. So he was able to say, yeah, I'd still like you, I know that you helped Lincoln, I would still like your advice. And so he wanted that. Carroll needed Grant as much as he needed her. Feeling the time had come for her to officially be recognized, she said, hey, look at all I did. I should get some recognition here. This was invaluable. Carroll sought Grant's support. Also, she said, still had unpaid bills for all these printed numbers she made, all these things that were printed. Well, I guess she never got paid for it. Who printed copies of her speeches and pamphlets, equaling about $6,000. I figure $6,000 in 1865 was a great deal of money. This woman spent all her money doing this, and she hadn't been reimbursed. In 1872, Carroll prepared a statement for Congress, okay, a memorial, and published it in June 8, 1872. In it were quotes from some of the most influential members and men in the government who argued that she be given the recognition and monetary compensation she was rightly due. So some of them stepped up and said, yes, this lady deserves this. Now keep that in mind, 1872. Carroll also had the backing of Scott Evans, who was now Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Texas. Unfortunately, there were too many men in the government who wanted this secret of a woman military advisor to remain just that, rumor. They would not recognize her role in any official sense, nothing. So even though she had some that were on her side, many of them said, no, this wouldn't look good. This would not look good. Nevertheless, Carroll had no choice but to accept it. For during her 9-year fight for recognition, she had grown ill and needed the money to take care of herself. So for 9 years, she's trying to get reimbursed for something she did during the war. In summary, her personality, she was very difficult, she was outspoken, she was sly. She eventually gained even the president's trust at a time when having an official woman cabinet member was unthinkable. She made great strides when you think about it. At that time, for a woman, wow. But have we heard about her? No. If you look in books, I've read a lot of books. You can find her, but not a lot. There's not pages on her. There might be a little sentence or something on her. Anna Ella Carroll, a Somerset County anti-slavery political activist who was a military strategist and secret member of President Lincoln's cabinet, has remained a shadowy and almost enigmatic figure in Maryland history for a long time. Okay. There was a lot of controversy about her role as a military strategist during the Civil War. It was debated. Some say yes, some say no. President Lincoln sent her accompanied by an Army officer to observe, report, and member of the Tennessee Plan. Her reports resulted in major military strategy and eventually doomed the Confederacy and ended the intervention of the European nations. All of this happened. But Carroll didn't always play nice with the government. Accounts differ as to whether she really helped Lincoln and advisor even come up with a plan, which brought Union soldiers into Southern territory long before his execution. Some debate, no, she didn't have anything to do with that. The president and his cabinet kept her authorship a secret. The public was not to know that the Union plans were devised by not only a civilian, but a woman. Carroll continued to advise the federal government and write Union propaganda throughout the whole war. Even after she did the Tennessee Plan, she still kept doing pamphlets and advising him. She, though, laid claim to the victory and demanded to be recognized, fighting for the remainder of her life for official recognition and a pension for her service. You know, these are not things that are out of sight. I mean, she'd do them, but, okay. Unlike most other battles in her life, she lost this one. She lost it. Remember, she started in 1872? After the war and following the assassination of Lincoln, Carroll's apartment in Washington, D.C. was burglarized, with many documents stolen, and it's believed they were burned. The incident cleared the way for Grant to take full credit for planning the Tennessee campaign. So he kind of went behind her back and he said that he did it all. And so mysteriously, all of these things were burned, and she has no recourse to say, here they are, they're gone. She appealed to Congress for recognition and compensation for her contribution to the war. She went before Congress. In the 1870s and the 1880s, she tried to get reimbursed for monies the government owed her. Reason she was denied, because she was a woman. And a vote for her was a vote for suffrage. And of course, they didn't want women's suffrage. And so they thought, well, if we recognize her as an important contributor to the Civil War, we're recognizing that, gee, she knew a lot of military, political things. You know, she would want the right to vote. And if, you know, and she would say, well, you know, if this woman was able to do all this, why can't we all vote? So they said, no way. We're not going to recognize her for those reasons. First, she's a woman, and secondly, we don't want any of these women to get big ideas about voting. After 1870, however, she had to devote much time to trying to gain payment for the $5,000. Now, in 2022, that's how much it was actually equivalent of, which she insisted the government still owed her for her wartime publications. She went through 20 years of congressional hearings to get what was due her. By 1881, a bill was finally introduced to Congress, and she said, wow, I'm making progress here, to grant recognition and a pension to her, right? So this is 1881. The compensation was to be at a rate given to major generals. Wow, you know, she was going to really make out here. Unfortunately, President Garfield was assassinated that year while the bill was being considered in Congress. And House Bill 7256 mysteriously disappeared. It was gone. They don't know what happened to it. I mean, a lot of this stuff is kind of off the wall, you might say. By 1885, every military committee but one voted in her favor, but no bill ever passed through Congress. She filed a claim in the United States Court of Claims in 1885, but was denied. And you find this a lot when I do programs on women. They're denied over and over and over, like Bella Lockwood, I did one on her, she's from Gasport, and she wanted to be a lawyer, and they kept denying. She took all these classes, and then she had to take the bar, and they didn't even look at it. They just threw it away. They wouldn't give it to her. So, I mean, these women faced, a lot of problems and to overcome. Instead, Congress passed a bill to put Anna Carroll's name on the pension roll. Oh, okay. To pay her $50 a month for life for the important military service rendered by her during the late Civil War. The only problem is she only had a couple more years to live by then, so it wasn't a great thing here. The big question is, why would a woman fight to participate in the political process that purposely excluded her? But many did. How could a slave-owning Southern be a staunch Lincoln supporter? But many of her did. Did she really help plan for the Civil War system? And all of these are questions to be answered by different historians, and many of them have different views on this. When it comes to her, there are more questions, like I said, than answers, and therein lies the fascination of this largely forgotten woman. The question is, was Carroll a self-interested woman or a martyr to a nation that would rather deny her due than admit a woman could win a war? That depends on who you ask, okay? If the person you ask remembers Carroll's name, and almost of them don't, but there are a few books, you can find a few books on it. Her later years are very sad. She was an invalid, supported by funds raised by the GAR and the Women's Relief Corps vets. Evidently, her family, being in Maryland, probably lost a lot of the money during the Civil War, so this is not lost. Every year in her hometown, they hold a memorial service in her honor. In 1894, she died of Bright's disease, a kidney ailment, at the age of 79. So she did live quite a long life, and she died in 18. Now, if we notice that, it has 2 different years, doesn't it? Now, us people that do genealogy, that happens quite often. If you'll notice, they had 94 there and 93 there with the same date, okay? And a lot of times even Find a Grave or the censuses or all the different official documents aren't always the same. Old Trinity Church in Maryland, she's buried there with other family members. Located near the church, there is a marker, which is pretty good. They do have recognized her. 20th century. Now, not until the 20th and 21st century that really most of these women got some recognition. In 1938, there's a movie called Strange Glory. Real old movie. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it, but it's a short from a historical mystery series. Takes a long look at the debate of who gets credit for the Tennessee Plan. So there's a movie on there. In this series, MGM offered up fascinating stories, and this episode talks about her. Here's the plot. During the American Civil War, General Grant carries out the Tennessee Plan to bounce out the Confederate fly lines. This proves to be vital actions in the North that push us out. And she's in it, and she's advising Lincoln. Well, into the 20th century, Carroll was hailed as a feminist heroine whose contributions were denied because of her sex. Some scholars, however, have attempted to discredit her tale, argue that she was more a relentless self-promoter than a woman who saved the Union. In 1959, the State Historical Society unveiled a monument to her with the words, "Maryland's most distinguished lady." Okay. So finally, like I said, by late 20th century, early 21st century, people are finally recognizing women. A great humanitarian and close friend of Lincoln. And it tells that she conceived the Tennessee Plan and guided the president, and so, it's substantiated there. In 2004, research published in 2004 unveiled new sources, primarily Maryland political histories and Lincoln administration records, that analyzed the Maryland Know-Nothing Party in a new progressive light. These articles generally support Carroll's role in the Tennessee Plan. The original planning, the original picture, like on my shirt in there, remember, with the empty chair. Well, this is very, very interesting. This lady is redoing it and painting it with her in the picture, which is kind of neat. And she is very good. The rest of the people look exactly like they did, okay? But she's added her. As a woman artist and an American citizen, I'm deeply honored to have been commissioned to do this painting. I feel a strong connection with Anna, and I'm grateful to be able to lend my talents to help share her story and be a part of the long overdue recognition she rightly deserves. So she has painted her into, now it's not, the chair is not empty, and she has painted it, and it was commissioned to be done. But you notice the year, 2010. And like I said, last part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, many more markers, many more documents, many more different people have been substantiating the role that American women played. But it's a different time period now. Look at all the women that are CEOs and the governor and run for president or in Congress. It's a whole different perspective on what women can do. So now this is okay to publish because it goes with our norms of today. This just tells, I'm not going to read all that, but it just tells how she was commissioned to do this and part of the cabinet. Lost River, I have this DVD. Great. That's where I got the top Lincoln secret weapon. Great movie. And it was written in 2010. It's a great movie if you get a chance. I bought it. Lost River, is a 100-minute feature based on the life of Anna Ella Carroll. It traces her right through everything. Now, some of you may recognize this guy here. Felix Klein. Anybody go to the Mumford? He's the guy that plays Lincoln at Mumford. When, on the major, when they have their Civil War days and everything. I met him, I had a picture taken with him. And I thought, oh, and he was in this. I thought, that's pretty cool. And, great movie if you get a chance. Like I said, I bought it a lot off eBay. But a great movie to see. And it really goes through basically like what I did with my research and everything. But I thought it was so interesting that this guy, I met him, and I had a picture taken with him, and he's the guy that often is at Mumford for the Civil War days. The release of Lost River coincided with a recent publication of a 700-page book about Carroll. So more books have been written about her. You can find books not written about her. In 2016, they declared an Anna Ella Carroll Day in Dorchester County, and she, is the history overlooked her contribution, and now they have a whole day set aside for her in Maryland on that day. Like I said, there's many books written about her. Some of the libraries, I bought most of these. But she is really, very interesting character. And they find, like I said, if you look at the copyright of these books, they're all the 21st century. They're all not very old books. There's also a novel which I read based on a true story about her. And then this is an older one. This one was written in the 20th century. But it's very interesting about womanhood of sword. Once again, a woman was not recognized for her accomplishments in early American history. Women's names were forgotten. If you do genealogy, it's very hard to find maiden names sometimes. They were Mrs. So-and-so. And it's really hard to trace them. And they weren't included in history books. They weren't given the credit due. But like I said, end of the 20th century and the 21st century, they're finally doing more and more on this. And this is one reason I try to do. In fact, this winter I'm in Naples, Florida, and I present every month at this one library. I'm doing a whole series on famous women in history. And then in April, I do a famous women trivia game, and the audience gets to participate. It's all based on programs either that year or other years that I've given. I like to end with this. I end with this on almost all my programs about women. Well-behaved women rarely make history. If you just sit there quietly and go, and listen to everything your husband said, you're not going to, nobody's going to remember you, okay? But all the women I talk about, they were not well-behaved women. And the other one I like, do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there's no path and leave a trail. And she definitely did this, and most of the women in American history that I talk about, they did. They went off the given path. They went to places and did things that weren't supposed to be done by women at the time. And they accomplished a lot. Okay, that's my program. I hope you enjoyed it. Are there any questions, comments? Hopefully you learned something.
Good job.
Yeah, it was very good. woman. Now you know all about her. And you can Google her name, and there are books now, and that movie is great.
Where do you get all this information, Joyce?
Oh, many places. I have all those books. I use a lot of books. I mean, the internet is great, you know, I'll go there too, but sometimes a lot of the stuff I got from books, they tend to give more detailed information. And that's mostly books, but I spend a lot of time researching, a lot of time, yes.
Search the library catalog for her name.
Pardon?
So search the library catalog for her name.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can search the library, but I don't know, I haven't looked to see if Richmond has any books on her, but they might. Okay. Or sometimes there's a library system where you can see what else, but if you check her name, you might come up with something, hopefully. Like I said, there's more books now out, and I know when I present in Naples at the libraries, they bought some of the books so that they could have them, so after people saw our presentation, they could go read some more. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Joyce. Thank you, everybody, for coming. One more round of applause. Just a quick PSA, upcoming events. This Thursday is our next Java with Joe, and yours truly will be presenting on the hangings of Genesee County, backed by popular demand. And then next Thursday, we have a concert. Bart Dentino will be playing at 7 p.m., so you don't want to miss that. Then we have 2 more guest speakers coming up the first week of August. August 6th, we have John Dwyer talking about the stories from his book, From the Front Porch to the Back Patio, his time living in Batavia from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then the next night, we have Ian Sepula from the Herschel Carousel Museum, who will be doing his presentation on Boulder Park. So you don't want to miss that. Both things are at 7, and there's a load more coming up. Check the website, Facebook, and if you're a member of the email blast, we'll all have this information. So we hope to see you at the upcoming things. So have a good night.
Good night.